Thunder Alley, a new game by GMT Games, a racing game inspired by NASCAR. And maybe this will be a turn-off for some people, and not every gamer is a big fan of NASCAR, but what can I say? I'm not a fan of NASCAR, and I'm not a fan of war, and yet I still play war games, so I don't see why I wouldn't play this one. I did play this one, and I'm glad I did because I really enjoyed it. Thunder Alley, big box, pretty heavy box, mainly due to 2 mounted boards that you find in here. This is a game in which you do not play the role of a single pilot like it happens in other racing games. You manage a team of cars, and what you're trying to do is to get a good overall final position for all of your cars. It is not just about pushing one of your cars to cross the finish line first, because if you do that, but then all of your other cars are placed very low in the final placement, then you may still lose the game. It is about getting a good overall position for your team. Let me show you how this big, heavy game works. Each player controls a team of cars, each car represented by a counter, such as this one. Each team also has a sheet to keep track of the damage that each car receives and of other things, other information in the game. At the beginning of the game, cars set up on the starting grid, which is here in this map, and the order in which they set up is determined randomly. Every time you need to make a determination about a random event in the game, you draw a card from this deck and you look at the bottom bar of the card and you start reading left to right. The team that is in play and that you encounter first, reading left to right, is the one that the random effect applies. If there's a random effect in this case, we have yellow and red, then the effect applies to yellow, because that's the one that is found first, reading left to right. You also use this to set up the game. The number of cars that each team controls depends on the number of players. The more players you have, the less cars are in each team, and vice versa. So suppose that we are setting up the game here, all the cars are ready to go, and woohoo, that's great. After you set up the cars, each player receives a hand of cards from this deck. The number of cards that go in your hand is equal to the number of cards you have in play plus 1. With 6 cards in your team, you will get a hand of 7 cards. Turn structure and the general idea of the game is pretty simple, it's pretty basic. You look at your cards, and starting with the first player, who is the team leader in each who is the leader of the race in each turn. At the end of each turn, you determine who is the leader. That player will go first next turn. Well, starting with that player, each player activates a car in their team. To activate a car, you play a card, you apply the effect to that car. After you're done, you flip the car to the opposite side, which has a darker frame to indicate that the card was activated, and then the game moves to the next player, who plays a card, activates a car, and you go on like this around the table until all cards have been activated, and at that point each player will have a card in their hand, because remember, the hand of cards is number of cards plus 1. You have to activate all of your cards, and you have to move them as much as possible. You have to try to spend as many movement points as possible. You kind of have to be in the spirit of the game. I guess that there are ways of playing the game in a little bit of a gamey fashion, but those are discouraged because I think that kind of kills the game. There are 4 basic types of movement in the game: solo movement, draft, pursuit, and lead. Solo movement is the most basic one. It simply means that you play a card with the solo movement effect on it, you choose the card you're activating, and you move that card by itself by the number of movement points indicated on the car. When the car is on the track, you will use the big number printed on top. The small number you only use when the car is coming back on the track after leaving a pit stop. So usually you use the big number. If you play this card on a car, the car receives 8 movement points. You cannot move diagonally, and moving to an empty space costs a single movement point. So you can move laterally or forward in the direction of the race. Suppose I'm playing this card. To activate that card, then it would be 1, 2 movement points. I still have 6 to spend, and I need to try to spend them as much as possible, spend as many of them as possible. After you leave a space, you cannot go back to that space in the same turn, because you'd be too gamey if you just kept going back and forth. It would just look so silly. You can move into empty spaces, but you can also move into spaces occupied by other cars by displacing them. It costs 2 movement points to enter a space on your side that contains another car. In other words, it takes 2 points to displace a car laterally. Suppose that this car wants to enter this space, it will spend 2 movement points. Now what happens to that car? Well, the car is displaced, which means it moves to the next adjacent space, and if there is another car there, that gets displaced too. However, as you can see, cars may end up having to be displaced from places where they cannot really move laterally. In that case, a car that needs to be displaced laterally is displaced backwards. And that car in turn displaces other cars, and you keep displacing cars until everything is resolved, until everything makes sense. So in that case, that car moves that one laterally, this one tries to move that one laterally, but this one doesn't go laterally, goes back and pushes everybody else in that line there back 1 spot. And this car now has spent a total of 4 movement points. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can also displace cars that are in front of you, and that costs 3 movement points. And again, everything is very organic. When you push a car, and that car would push another car, well, that other car is pushed, and everybody's pushed accordingly to what's happening until the entire movement sort of like reverberated through the lines and the clumps of cars. This is for solo movement. Draft movement, oh, this is interesting. Draft movement, draft movement is related to the concept of linking. Cars are linked in the game if they are adjacent to another car that is immediately in front of them or immediately behind them. This car, for example, can be linked to those 2 cars. Draft movement, when you activate a car with draft movement, you're also activating all of the cars that are linked to it. And linking also reverberates. So actually, if you are activating this car with draft movement, that car is linked to these 2 cars, but also to these 2 cars. Everybody is linked together as long as you have an uninterrupted line. There's no maximum length to the line of cars that are linked together. It may be 2 of them, it may be all of the cars in the game. And when you activate somebody with draft, so you're moving the entire line of cars, only the car that you're activating is spending movement points, only that car will be flipped to the done side at the end of movement, but you are effectively moving everybody else in the draft. Interesting enough though, before you are linked, you activate a car with draft movement, and before you're linked, you can move forward or even laterally as much as you want, and that's fine. But once you move in a position where you would get linked, from that moment on, you have to use the draft. That is, you have to move all of your cars in a single line, or all the cars that are linked to your car in a single line. And once the draft starts, cars cannot change lane anymore. They cannot move laterally. They have to go in a straight line. Another thing that was pretty tricky and that wasn't entirely clear to me when I read the rulebook the first time was that when you play draft movement, in reality, you can link cars only when you start moving forward. That is, if I'm in this position, cars are not linked with my car at the second that the car is activated. If I decide to move this car forward, then yes, forward movement creates the draft, and everybody has to move. But if I move laterally before I moved forward at all, then those cars are not linked. I move here, and if then I want to move forward, I created a draft here. But I could have done 1, 2, and since I never move forward, only laterally, I have not created a draft. So there are circumstances in which a draft movement could simply be used as a solo movement. In most cases, if you're playing it, you will probably want to create drafts. Something very important is that after you play a card, the card receives a wear marker. Most cards have a symbol printed there under the title, which indicates the wear marker that you place on the card that you have activated at the end of movement. I have activated card number 8 with that card. Well, that's great, no effect, but suppose I had activated with that card, then I receive the purple wear marker, which I place on my car. Suppose it was car number 8, then I place it here. I place it here because each car has 2 boxes, one for permanent damage and one for temporary damage. Temporary damage or temporary wear may be removed during a pit stop, permanent stays there, which is, well, problematic. Pursuit movement. Pursuit movement is pretty much the same as draft, with the difference that you have to think of it as pushing. In reality, I guess it is that the car is being sucked up in a draft that somebody else has created. The car has just joined the draft, but it functionally can be thought of as pushing. The pursuit movement is exactly the same as draft, but it only applies to cars in front of you. To a single car or to potentially a long line of cars. Think of it as pushing other cars against once the draft that you are pushing has started, then the car cannot change lanes, cannot move laterally, but it can do that before the link is created, before the draft is created. Lead movement is a variant of the draft. Again, it allows you to link cars to the active car, but only cars that are behind it, right behind it. That is, the one behind it, and then possibly other cars that form an uninterrupted line from that one. Lead movement, however, has 2 differences when compared to draft and pursuit. The general idea is the same, but lead movement linking only happens the moment of activation. So with draft or pursuit, you can move a little bit and then create the draft, and that may alter the draft that you have as you go. For example, you may start with a draft and then pick up more cars as you go. The cars that are attached to your lead movement are determined at the beginning of the lead movement, and other cars are not picked up during movement. Also, once you have the lead movement, you're performing the lead movement, the car may move laterally and the other cars may still follow, whereas with draft and pursuit you cannot move laterally once you start moving together with other cars. If I'm activating that car with lead movement, I can move it like this, 1, and these 2 cars are following, and if I move laterally, the other cars keep following very zealously. They just do as they're told. After all cars have been activated, you determine who is the leader for that turn. If this were the final situation in this turn, then car number 11 is the leader. The car receives a marker which is placed on the card of that team, and then a random effect is drawn from this deck. These events will simply, make stuff happen, and that's usually bad stuff. This is one of the rare ones which actually is good. Because of the weather, each team may return 1 tire token. Tire tokens are wear tokens that your cards receive for using certain movements, certain types of movement. Each team may return 1 tire token to the stock from 1 car in the owner's choice. The car with the most tire tokens moves straight back 10 spaces and then down to the inside lane. Not so great. The car with the most tire tokens blows a tire must make a 10 space pit stop. Most cards have a green flag, which means that the effect of the card does not apply to the entire race. However, there may be random events which affect everybody, and those events have a yellow flag, and that force a yellow flag situation in which cars have to stop and pretty much realign. They have to form into a line starting from where the leader is. The cars have to get together there. Pretty much what it means is that the race is restarted. And that can have all sort of interesting effects. Of course, you may be behind a lot and a yellow flag will help you. You may be in front, a yellow flag damages you, but there's no way of predicting these or preventing them. This is just randomness that may affect everybody at any point in the game. Whether you are performing a turn with a yellow flag or a green flag, after the event is resolved, players can choose to perform a pit stop. It works in slightly different ways if you're under a green flag. If you're under a green flag, the cars that the pit stop is simply placed in that inside lane, which is the apron. It's placed in that inside lane and move backwards by 5 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, this one would go out of the screen. I don't like that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It is moved backwards by 5 spaces. You remove all of the temporary wear markers from the card, from that car, well, from the box on the car team. And then next turn the card can move. The first move that it has to perform is immediately out of the apron. It has to go back to the main racetrack, even if it has to displace other cars. And when coming out of the pit stop, the cars use the smaller movement number printed on each card. And also the negative effects, the wear effects of the card do not apply to a card that's just coming out of the pit stop. For pit stops under yellow flags, which you perform after you have created the situation here, for those ones you still move the cars to the apron after the car has announced a pit stop. But then later what happens simply is that as these cars are still in this situation here, the line is rearranged and the cars that took a pit stop join the race, getting to the bottom of the line. As your cars race, they will accumulate wear markers. There are different types of wear that you may take. Tire, body, suspension, fuel, engine, suspension, and transmission. Some of these types of wear are permanent, some are temporary. So you move, you receive a wear marker, and you place it on the car that moved. If you have 0, 2, or 1 wear marker on a card, there are no negative effects. If you have 3 or more of any type in any combination, then you start having penalties. The markers all have the same effects when it comes to affecting movement. It is just that some combinations of markers will interact in different ways with the random events in the game. But when it comes to movement, they're all the same. With 3 wear markers of any type in any combination, your car has a movement penalty of -3 movement points. So if you're playing a card that gives you 8 movement points, now your car is only moving by 5. With 4 wear markers, the penalty is of -4. With 5 is of -5. With 6, well, you don't want that to happen because the car is retired of the game. Just too much wear, it cannot race anymore. Each track comes with a recommended number of laps, and you use this track here to record the lap that is being performed, that is being completed. Once a car completes the last lap, that car triggers the end of the game. As car pass the finish line at the end of the last lap, they receive trophy markers. So there's one for first place, second place, fourth place, of course there's also third place. There's one for everybody. So players receive trophies, and as you can see, trophies have a red number printed on them. That is the number of victory points that each trophy is worth. Also, you earn victory points for each of your cars that was turn leader during the game, that received a turn leader marker during the game. Each such car receives a victory point. There is also a victory point that is assigned to the car that was leader most often for most laps. Then at that point you total all the victory points the players earned from the markers that they collected, and at that point the player with the highest total is the winner of the game. This game is more than the sum of its parts, more than the sum of its rules. When I read the rule book, I thought, okay, this is going to be nice. I think this is going to be entertaining. I had no idea of the immense amount of enjoyment that I was going to have out of this game. The rules are pretty simple. There are a couple of points in the rule book which are a little opaque. Probably things could be tightened up a little bit more. But overall, I was able to play the game, and the game turned out to be much more exciting than what I would have ever imagined. The rules are simple, linear, but they result in an incredibly exciting experience. This is much more of a tactical game than a strategic game. It's very hard to plan ahead. You can plan ahead some things, for example, when you decide which cars leave the track to take a pit stop, and you can try to combine their return with other groups of cars of yours that may suck them in and help them with the draft. But other than that, it's really hard to plan things ahead because you don't know what cards you're going to receive next turn. You do not know what the other players are doing. And since card movement is so interactive and the opponent will move many of your cards during his turn, the situation is going to change on the board continuously, which is something that really, really works. It's something that creates all sorts of challenges, that keeps the game fresh, the pace moving. You are dealing with a continuously changing situation. You have to react to what everybody else is doing, to what you're dealt in terms of cards. These are all fun challenges which potentially could turn into a puzzle. I see how some players may be tempted to think of this too much in terms of maxing out effects and maximizing the power of their hands. These players will probably kill the game, but actually even those who tend to do that, and I play the game with some of these players, then after a while they relax. They realize that really there's a certain zen component to this. It's useless to do too much brain bursting because the factors are continuously changing. And once you start playing the game in this fashion, like let's ride the wave and see how I can interact with this strange and changing world, then the game becomes incredibly exciting. It's hard for me to put into words really what it feels to play the game, because in a certain sense the experience is so much more fun and exciting than what the rules would let you think that you have to try it for yourself. You owe it to yourself to try this game because it's incredible. I was hooked to the game from the very beginning. The first turn, people are struggling in a little clamp of cars, trying to maximize in their position, and sometimes not much happens. Cars don't even move all that far. And then a group starts going real fast. Other groups try to capitalize on that, or they do not want to be left behind. You will have cars that try to pass, to put themselves in front of long lines of cars so they can exploit the future pushes from their own cars or from cars of the opponent. The overall strategy seems to be obvious, well, just try to move as many of your cars as you can, by as many spaces as you can, without helping the opponent too much. But of course, what seems to be easy and linear in riding, then is not so easily implemented, because the opponent is trying to do exactly the same to you. So you will have your move ready, and then at the last minute the opponent places a car right before yours, and all of your wonderful move, if you execute it as you had planned, will turn out in simply giving a huge advantage to the opponent. This fluid pace of the game really gives the game a very exciting quality, because you're always involved. You can never let your guard down. You always want to know what's happening next. With the right group of players, the game has a fast pace. It goes around the table fast. If somebody starts taking too much time taking a turn, just be brutal. Just force them to play the game, because not only are they not understanding the feeling, the philosophy of the game, they also may reduce the enjoyment for other players. This is a game which with the right group of people works wonderfully. The large amount of things that are outside of your control make the game surprisingly friendly for a solitaire game. Yes, I played it with other players, but I also played it solitaire. Like I play multiplayer war games in solitaire mode, playing all sides at the best of my possibilities. And it was still fun. It was still fun. The game has a great narrative. Who expected this? Has a great narrative, as you see how, well, each turn per se by itself may seem a little chaotic. It seems like its own thing, but you see the overall narrative, the overarching narrative that does develop turn after turn. Random events, they can be really random. They can make the craziest things happen at the least expected, least favorable moment. Your car has some damage to the engine. You're planning to take a pit stop next turn, and just before that happens, a random event to make that damage permanent, forces you to retire the car from the game. Terrifying stuff may happen, as it very well should, because this is not chess. This is meant to capture an event that has a lot of complexity, a lot of fluid aspects to it, and indeed a lot of unpredictable things that do escape any single player's ability to change things, and they should indeed force you into situations that you don't like from time to time, and especially that you cannot expect. Thunder Alley, this is a game that I enjoyed phenomenally, immensely. I'm playing online games right now. I'm playing email games so I can keep playing it. I'm going to bring this game to me at Gen Con 2014, and I'm going to look for opportunities to play with large numbers of people. The game really works well with any number of people, because the more players you have, the less cards per player, so the overall playing time remains the same. Accessible game, easy to teach, tons of fun to play. This is a game that I will be playing a lot in the future. A keeper for sure in my collection, and definitely one of the most fun games that I played in a long time. Highly, highly recommended.